So as we plan for a return to services, there are two things that we want to be working through. The first is the practical details of what services will look like. The back to church nuts and bolts. Now, Hayden, let me test your memory. What are the three things, the three goals?
I will not forget because they're written here.
Excellent.
Meaningful connections, predictable services and safe gatherings.
Correct. And part of that is making the most of the opportunity to welcome people.
Absolutely.
The second thing that we're talking about is back to church basics, the theological principles behind our return to services. Or in other words...
we want the Bible to shape our decisions.
Okay, so last week we talked about why meeting together matters, and this week...
God elects the government.
Right.
In a sense. Now,
I'm pretty sure I voted in the last election. Why do you say God elects the government?
Now, which way did you vote in the... No, I won't ask that. Because we read in Romans chapter 13 that God is the one who establishes the authorities. Government is a gift from God for our good. Government is there to promote good, to restrain evil. And on the whole, I'm really grateful that we have stable government in Australia. I'm sure there's nuance and light and shade. But in my view, the government works as hard as they can to serve the people as best they can. And that's something for which we should be thankful to God.
Now, Australians treat politicians a little irreverently. In fact, funny story, when I wrote this in my notes, I wrote pollies.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
I think Australians really do struggle with language, because when we use language in that way, it's not always meant in an irreverent way. When we're talking about our ministers or bishops or politicians, we sometimes joke a little, but our posture should be one of respect. I do think Australians, here you go, I've got your little present.
Oh, thank you.
It's a poppy. It's not a poppy.
It's not a poppy.
Michael tells him it's a carnation. Campbell said it was a flower. It's quite a tall poppy though, if you get the point. Australians don't like tall poppies. That they are sceptical of people who they think have risen above their natural station in life, and politicians often fall into that category. And I think that's a little understandable given the history of our country, whether that's the Indigenous people or the European settlers, many of whom were convicts. Both of those groups have reason to be sceptical of authority. But we are told in Romans chapter 13 that we are to submit to the authorities. We are to be subject to the governing authorities. And so I think it's right that we can keep our politicians accountable. We can vote, of course, we can lobby. That makes perfect sense to me. But our posture ought to be one of respect, and our fundamental muscle memory should be to be obedient to the government who are put in place by God for our good.
So if God elects the government, is it ever okay to disagree with a government decision? What about Dietrich?
When you say what about Dietrich, if you're unfamiliar with the story, go and read it. There's a comic book version of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life that I have that's called The Spy Who Tried to Kill Hitler. So that might give you some sense of where he landed on the issue of civil disobedience. I don't recommend you trying to kill anyone, actually. We ought to be very slow to any kind of civil disobedience. So we read here, again in Romans 13, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted. And so on the whole, we obey the law and the reasonable instructions of the government.
And in fact, in 1 Timothy, we read that we are to pray for our government.
Yeah, we are to pray for our government. It says that we're to pray for kings and for those who are in authority. It's true, though, that there are limits to the governmental authority. Though we are called to submit to others, there are limits to that. If the government asks us to do something that is immoral or illegal, then we as Christians have to respectfully say we are not going to comply with that instruction. In Acts chapter 4, the Jewish authorities were speaking to the apostles and saying, you've got to stop talking about Jesus. It's causing all kinds of dramas. And the Jewish authorities were both the religious and the civic authorities at that time. And the Christians there said, we have to decide whether we're going to obey you in this instance or obey God. God has told us to keep preaching Christ, and so with respect, we're going to keep doing that. So that's an example of where there are limits to governmental authority. The good news for us in our situation at the moment is as we approach 70 and 80%, we've got the government's support and blessing to continue preaching Christ, to figure out how do we welcome all people and to do that in a way that is taking every reasonable step to keep people safe.
Well, thank you, Hayden. That was theological principle number 2. Number 1 was?
Meeting together matters.
Right, and theological principle number 2, God is the one who elects the government.
Do you want your flower?
No, thank you.